Your brother's vacation is a priority right now, Zora, not this rushed little party. That was the text my mother sent me hours before my rehearsal dinner. By dawn, my entire family had boarded a flight to Milan, leaving empty chairs where my parents should have been. I walked down the aisle on the arm of a man I had known for only a few weeks, and I smiled. I smiled because by Thursday, the video of our vows would hit 3 million views. I smiled because my mother would call me 85 times in a panic, screaming that my father's boss had seen the clip and realized exactly who my groom was. But to understand how one wedding weekend set in motion the collapse of my family's entire empire, you have to know what happened in the botanical conservatory the night before. I am Zora, 35 years old, and I work as a crisis public relations strategist. I fix disasters for high-profile clients. I control narratives, mitigate damages, and spin catastrophes into triumphs. But despite all my professional success, I have never been able to fix the disaster that is my own family. The air inside the glass walls of the downtown botanical conservatory was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive catering. I stood alone near the entrance, holding a seating chart printed on heavy ivory cardstock. The ambient lighting cast a warm golden glow over the tables perfectly arranged for my rehearsal dinner. It was supposed to be an intimate evening celebrating my upcoming marriage to Xavier, a man who had swept into my life with quiet intensity and asked me to marry him after a whirlwind romance. The heavy oak doors of the conservatory swung open with a loud thud that echoed off the high glass ceiling. My mother Vivian marched into the room. She was draped in a tailored silk pantsuit that probably cost more than the elaborate floral arrangements surrounding us. Right behind her was my older brother Jamal, scrolling on his phone with his usual air of bored entitlement. Clinging to Jamal's arm was his wife Chelsea, a blonde woman whose constant manufactured anxieties dictated our entire family's schedule. Vivian did not offer a hug. She did not comment on how beautiful the venue looked. She did not ask how I was feeling on the eve of my wedding. Instead, she marched straight over to the primary catering table, knocking over a crystal water glass in the process, and slammed a sleek leather envelope onto the pristine white tablecloth. I stared at the envelope. I easily recognized the gold foil logo of a luxury international airline. "We are leaving for Milan in the morning," Vivian announced, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. Jamal's stress levels are absolutely peaking from his new startup launch, and Chelsea desperately needs this baby moon for her anxiety. "So we will not be attending your little backyard party tomorrow." I stood frozen for a second, processing the sheer audacity of her words. A baby moon. They were missing my wedding for a baby moon. I kept my voice carefully level, falling back on my crisis management training. "You are missing your only daughter's wedding for a vacation," I stated flatly. "It is not a real wedding anyway." Zora Vivian scoffed, waving her hand dismissively at the beautifully set tables. "You have known the man for what, 2 weeks? 3. It is a rushed mistake, and I refuse to cancel your brother's mental health retreat for a fling that will end in divorce by Christmas." As she spoke, Jamal casually wandered over to the main display table. Without asking, without even a glance in my direction, he grabbed a bottle of vintage champagne that was meant for the final toast tomorrow. He examined the label with a greedy smirk. "Nice spread," Jamal muttered, tucking the expensive bottle securely under his arm. "Chelsea and I can drink this on the flight. Consider it a wedding tax since we bothered to show up tonight." That was the moment the fragile dam holding back decades of resentment finally cracked. I did not deliver a tearful monologue. I did not beg for their love or understanding. Instead, I looked directly at the champagne bottle, then up into my brother's arrogant eyes. "A wedding tax!" I snapped, my voice ringing with sudden authority. "Just like the college tuition tax you took from me. Is this exactly like when you convinced Dad to drain my university fund to finance your first 3 failed tech companies?" Vivian immediately stepped between us, physically shielding her 38-year-old son as if he were a vulnerable toddler. Her eyes flashed with that familiar toxic fury I had grown up fearing. "Do not speak to your brother that way. Jamal is an innovator. He is building a generational legacy for this family. You just manipulate the media and clean up messes for a living. You should be grateful we even stopped by your venue to drop off our gifts." Right on cue. I felt my phone buzz in the pocket of my dress. I pulled it out. It was a text message from my father, Calvin. He had not even bothered to walk into the conservatory with them. He was waiting out in the car. The text read, "I am not paying my half of the catering bill tomorrow. I need the liquidity to upgrade Jamal and Chelsea's hotel suite in Milan. Do not make a scene and do not disrespect Chelsea's mental health issues. If you embarrass this family tonight, I will have the lawyers remove you from the family trust completely." I read the words twice, the glowing screen blurring slightly before my eyes. My father, a senior executive who prided himself on his public image of immense wealth and generosity, was abandoning his financial commitment to my wedding to fund his golden boy's luxury vacation. And true to form, he was using my inheritance as a weapon to keep me compliant and quiet. I looked up from the screen. Chelsea was nervously playing with her designer handbag, watching me with a feigned expression of sympathy that did not reach her eyes. "Your father is waiting in the car," Vivian said impatiently, checking her diamond-studded watch. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a small, flimsy paper envelope. She tossed it onto the table next to the seating chart. "Here, our wedding gift, since we are missing the dinner tomorrow." I reached out and opened the envelope. Inside was a plastic $50 gift card to a fast casual chain restaurant. $50. From a family that lived in a gated estate, from a mother wearing a $2,000 suit, from a brother actively stealing a $300 bottle of champagne. The silence in the conservatory was profound. I looked at the cheap plastic card in my hand, then at the people who were supposed to be my family. For 35 years I had bent over backward to accommodate their demands. I had played the supportive sister, the quiet daughter, the crisis manager who fixed their public blunders behind the scenes. And my worth to them culminated in a $50 gift card and an empty chair at my wedding. I calmly picked up the plastic card with both hands. I did not cry. I did not scream. With a sharp, definitive crack, I snapped the gift card in half. I let the two pieces drop onto the immaculate white tablecloth. "Get out," I said, my voice dangerously soft. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. "Excuse me, you ungrateful little," I said, "get out of my venue." I repeated my tone, carrying the absolute uncompromising authority I used in boardrooms to silence panicking executives. "Take your plane tickets, take your stolen champagne, and take your desperate need to pretend Jamal is anything more than a failure who drains this family dry. I do not want you here tonight, and I do not want you at my wedding tomorrow." Jamal scoffed, turning toward the door and pulling his wife along. "Come on, Mom. Chelsea is getting anxious with all this negative energy. Let her have her little backyard party. She will be begging us for a loan when this guy leaves her." Vivian shot me a look of pure disgust. "You are a bitter, jealous woman, Zora. Do not bother calling us when this blows up in your face." They turned their backs and walked out, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they discussed the first-class lounge at the airport. I stood alone in the center of the vast, beautiful room. My hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly fading into a cold, hollow ache in my chest. Then the soft sound of footsteps approached from the shadowed alcove near the exotic orchids. Xavier stepped into the warm light. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his presence commanding and quietly powerful. He had been standing there the entire time, observing the brutal dynamic I had tried so hard to hide from him. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me it would be okay or try to minimize what had just happened. Instead, he walked right up to me, raised his hand, and gently wiped a single rogue tear that had escaped down my cheek. His eyes, usually warm and observant, were now flinty and cold as he stared at the heavy doors my family had just walked through. Without looking away from the exit, Xavier reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb moved quickly across the screen as he typed a message to his assistant. "Let them fly to Milan," Xavier whispered, his voice smooth, but laced with a lethal promise. "Enjoy your little backyard party tomorrow, my love, because by Monday morning they will be begging to come back, and they will not have a single dime left to pay for the return flight." Before Xavier and I left the conservatory that night, I called the catering director and paid Calvin's entire outstanding share myself. No vendor was going to suffer because my father had decided to weaponize money against me. Within minutes, every remaining invoice connected to my wedding was covered in my own name. For the first time in my life, my father could not use a promised payment as a leash around my neck. The morning of my wedding did not begin with a mother wiping away tears of joy or a father practicing his heartfelt speech in the hallway. It began with the quiet, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bridal suite, looking out over the private estate we had rented for the weekend. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, completely unbothered by the toxic family drama that had erupted less than 12 hours prior. I felt a profound sense of peace. The absence of Vivian, Calvin, and Jamal was not a void. It was a newly cleared space where my actual life could finally begin. Down below, my event team was executing the final touches on what my mother had so derisively called a little backyard party. She had envisioned a cheap, thrown-together barbecue. What she failed to realize was that a crisis public relations strategist knows exactly how to build an optic masterpiece on a tight deadline. The venue was a hidden architectural gem just outside the city limits, featuring terraced gardens and a vast reflection pool that mirrored the sky. We had transformed the space into a breathtakingly gorgeous, intimate sanctuary. Cascading arrangements of white orchids and deep green monstera leaves framed the altar. Thousands of floating candles were suspended above the dining tables waiting to be lit at dusk. It was understated, devastatingly elegant, and perfectly tailored to who Xavier and I were as a couple. I sipped my herbal tea, letting the warmth settle my nerves. For years, I had orchestrated events to make my father look good to his corporate board or to distract the press from Jamal's latest financial blunder. I had poured my talent into building their legacies. Today, every ounce of my expertise was dedicated to myself. I had hired a string quartet that was currently warming up near the reflection pool, the soft, rich notes of a cello drifting up to my open window. My makeup artist and hairstylist arrived exactly on time. They did not ask about my missing family. We had a strict no-drama protocol in place. They simply poured me a glass of sparkling water and got to work enhancing the glow that was already radiating from within me. While they worked, my mind shifted to the logistical countermove I had put into motion late last night. When my family chose Milan over my wedding, they intended to isolate me. They wanted me to walk down an empty aisle, feeling the sting of their absence, deeply humiliated that no one was there to witness my commitment to a man I had known for only a few weeks. But isolation is just a narrative, and I control narratives for a living. I had immediately contacted a premier cinematic production crew I frequently used for global corporate broadcasts. I hired them overnight to set up a flawless multi-camera live stream of the entire ceremony. If my parents thought I was going to hide my rushed wedding in the shadows, they were sorely mistaken. I sent the private encrypted streaming link to a curated list of my closest friends, former colleagues and mentors who lived out of state and could not make the short notice. I framed it as an exclusive, intimate digital viewing experience. The camera angles were perfectly blocked to capture the sheer beauty of the venue, the emotion of the vows, and the undeniable elegance of the event. I was ensuring that the people who genuinely loved me could share in my joy, completely bypassing the void my family tried to create. By the time I stepped into my wedding dress, a sleek, architectural silk gown that fit like a second skin, the real scale of what was happening began to unfold outside. From my vantage point on the second floor, I watched the arrival of the guests Xavier had casually referred to as a few close friends. I knew Xavier was successful. I knew he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who never had to look at a price tag. But I had not fully grasped the magnitude of the world I was stepping into until a literal fleet of black armored SUVs began rolling through the wrought iron gates of the estate. The security presence was discreet, but undeniable, the kind of protective detail usually reserved for heads of state or global dignitaries. As the heavy doors of the vehicles opened, the guests emerged. This was not a random assortment of tech bros or casual acquaintances. The people walking into my wedding venue represented a staggering concentration of generational wealth and modern African-American excellence. I recognized faces I had only seen on the covers of elite financial magazines. There were prominent venture capitalists, visionary software founders, and heavy-hitting real estate developers. These were men and women who moved markets with a single phone call, dressed in impeccable, understated luxury. They moved with a quiet, undeniable power. And they were all here for Xavier. They greeted him with deep, genuine affection, clasping his shoulder and pulling him into warm embraces. Xavier stood at the altar looking like a king holding court, dressed in a custom tuxedo that cut a striking silhouette against the white orchids. He was entirely relaxed, smiling as he spoke with his mentors and peers. My family had sneered at him, dismissing him as a random fling, a nobody. They had mocked his lack of a loud, flashy pedigree. Watching the Billionaires Club assemble in my garden to celebrate his marriage, I felt a deep, resonant thrill of vindication. When the time came for the ceremony to begin, I walked down the sweeping stone staircase and paused at the edge of the garden. Traditionally, this is the moment a father steps forward to offer his arm to proudly escort his daughter into her new life. Calvin was currently somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, probably sipping complimentary champagne and patting himself on the back for putting me in my place. I did not feel a single pang of loss. As the string quartet began to play a soaring, soulful arrangement, Xavier did not wait at the altar for me to make the journey alone. He broke tradition entirely. He walked down the center aisle, his eyes locked onto mine, ignoring the crowd of billionaires and titans around him. He stopped right in front of me, offered his arm, and together, side by side, we walked toward our future. The ceremony was everything I had ever wanted. It was brief, powerful, and stripped of all performative nonsense. When Xavier spoke his vows, his deep voice carried across the quiet reflection pool. He promised to be my sanctuary, my partner in every battle, and the calm in the center of any storm. I promised him my fierce loyalty, my unwavering support, and my absolute truth. As we exchanged rings, the sunlight caught the massive, flawless diamond on my finger, a quiet testament to the life he was providing for us. There were no dry eyes in the front rows. The cinematic cameras captured every perfect second, broadcasting our joy to the people who truly mattered. Following the ceremony, the garden seamlessly transitioned into an elegant sunlit reception. Crystal flutes were filled with champagne that cost more than my brother's entire startup valuation. As the waitstaff circulated with gourmet hors d'oeuvres, I stood near the reflection pool with my new husband, accepting warm congratulations from his incredible circle of friends. Right in the middle of a toast from a prominent tech investor, I felt the familiar sharp buzz of my phone tucked away in my small bridal clutch. My crisis PR instincts are hardwired into my DNA. Even on my wedding day, a specific pattern of vibrations alerts me to a potential social media escalation. I discreetly slipped the phone out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an Instagram notification. Chelsea, my desperately insecure white sister-in-law, had just posted a new photo. The image was a highly filtered staged shot, taken from the first-class cabin of their flight to Milan. Chelsea was holding a mimosa, leaning her head against Jamal's shoulder, both of them wearing matching designer sunglasses indoors. She had deliberately tagged my private account to ensure the notification would hit my phone during the exact hours of my reception. The caption beneath the photo was dripping with toxic passive-aggressive venom. It read, "Escaping rushed cheap weddings for some real luxury in Italy. Family first. Know your worth." She had timed it perfectly, hoping to inject a dose of anxiety and inadequacy directly into my veins on the happiest day of my life. She wanted me to look around my supposedly cheap little party and feel the crushing weight of their absence. She wanted me to feel worthless. I stared at the screen, reading the petty words. I looked up from the glowing device and took in the scene around me. I saw a fleet of armored SUVs parked in the circular drive. I saw a guest list comprised of the most powerful, wealthy, and brilliant African-American minds in the country. I saw a venue that looked like it had been pulled directly from the pages of an elite bridal editorial bathed in golden hour light. And then I looked at Xavier. He was laughing at a joke, his dark eyes catching the sunlight, looking more handsome and more completely mine than I could have ever dreamed. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel the need to craft a retaliatory response. I simply smiled, a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. I held down the power button on my phone, watching the screen go completely black, and slipped it back into my clutch. Let them have their cheap champagne in the sky, I thought to myself, turning back to my billionaire groom to raise my glass. Their turbulence was just beginning. The evening transitioned seamlessly from a sunlit garden ceremony into a reception that felt like a private gala at a modern art museum. We moved into a sprawling glass-enclosed pavilion that looked out over the illuminated reflection pool. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with quiet precision, offering trays of seared scallops and caviar, while a jazz band played soft covers of classic R&B hits. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and fresh orchids. I sat beside Xavier at our sweetheart table, feeling a profound sense of untouchable peace. I had completely banished my family from my thoughts. My brother Jamal and his wife Chelsea were currently somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, entirely convinced they had dealt me a crushing blow by abandoning me. I knew Chelsea was likely relying on the airplane Wi-Fi to refresh her social media feed, waiting for me to post a desperate, tearful plea or a sad photo of a half-empty catering hall. I gave her absolutely nothing. My phone remained zipped away in my bridal clutch. I was far too busy engaging in brilliant conversations with venture capitalists and software pioneers who treated me with immediate, genuine respect. As the dinner plates were cleared and the band transitioned to a more upbeat tempo, Xavier and I stepped off the dance floor to catch our breath. We were immediately approached by Malik. Malik was Xavier's best man and one of his oldest friends from their undergraduate days at Howard University. He was also a fiercely intelligent, highly respected senior editor for one of the most prominent financial news outlets in the country. Malik possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a massive social media following comprised of industry insiders, investors, and corporate executives. He carried 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed them to us with a warm, wide smile. Malik congratulated us again and then pulled his phone from his tuxedo jacket. He looked at me with a professional gleam in his eye, acknowledging my career as a crisis public relations strategist. He tapped the screen and held it out for me to see. It was a video he had recorded on his phone during our ceremony. The footage was raw, but incredibly cinematic, capturing the exact moment Xavier and I exchanged our vows. The lighting was golden and perfect, highlighting the deep contrast of Xavier's dark suit against the white floral arches. In the video, you could hear the absolute quiet reverence of the billionaire guests surrounding us, followed by Xavier's deep, unwavering voice, promising to protect and honor me. Zora Malik said, his voice respectful but eager. I know you both wanted to keep this entire weekend under the radar. But this 1 minute right here is pure magic. My timeline has been hounding me all day to confirm the rumors that the most elusive bachelor in the tech sector finally settled down. I would love to post this short clip on my main feed. Just a quick congratulations to my best friend and his beautiful new wife. But I will not press post unless you explicitly give me the green light. Xavier wrapped his arm around my waist and looked down at me. He did not care about social media or press coverage. He only cared about my comfort. It is entirely up to you, he murmured, kissing the side of my head. If you want this day to stay locked in a vault, Malik deletes the video right now. I stood there in my custom silk gown, holding my crystal glass, and let my professional instincts take the wheel. I thought about the narrative. I thought about the optics. My family had spent my entire life controlling the story. My father, Calvin, constantly manipulated facts to make himself look like a generous patriarch while financially draining me. My mother, Vivian, spun every one of my accomplishments into a footnote while amplifying my brother's failures as acts of misunderstood genius. And Chelsea had just attempted to humiliate me by framing my wedding as a cheap, rushed mistake. They had always relied on my silence to maintain their delusions of grandeur. If Malik posted this video, the silence would break. It would not be a petty emotional outburst from a scorned daughter. It would be a high-level verified broadcast to the corporate elite. It would firmly establish my new reality without me having to lift a single finger or say a single word in my own defense. The narrative would shift entirely out of their control and straight into the hands of the financial press. I looked at Malik and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. You have the green light, Malik, I said smoothly. Post it. Malik grinned, tapping his screen a few times before sliding the phone back into his jacket pocket. Done, he announced. Now go enjoy your party. We did exactly that. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in joyful insulation. I danced until my feet ached. We cut a magnificent towering cake and toasted to our future surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated our union. Xavier and I did not look at our screens for the rest of the night. We left the reception in a vintage Rolls-Royce showered in white rose petals, completely disconnected from the digital world. We were driven to a luxury high-rise in the city center, where Xavier had secured the entire top-floor penthouse suite for our wedding night. The suite featured wrap-around glass walls, offering a 360-degree view of the glowing city skyline. We spent the night wrapped in each other, completely oblivious to the massive digital earthquake that had just been triggered by Malik's single post. The next morning, I woke up to the sensation of warm sunlight spilling across the high thread count sheets. Xavier was already awake, sitting near the edge of the bed wearing soft linen lounge pants and drinking black coffee. He was looking out at the city, completely relaxed. I stretched lazily, feeling the pleasant ache in my muscles from dancing all night. I smiled, rolling over to the nightstand to check the time. I grabbed my phone and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, but the phone immediately froze. The device actually grew warm in the palm of my hand as its processor struggled to catch up with an absolute avalanche of data. Notifications were pouring in so fast, they blurred together into a continuous scrolling wall of white boxes. Messages, emails, alerts, and tags were hitting my device by the hundreds every single second. I sat up, pulling the silk sheet around my shoulders, my public relations radar instantly switching to high alert. I forced the phone to perform a hard reset. When the home screen finally loaded properly, I opened my primary social media application. Malik's 1-minute video clip of our vows had not just gained traction. It had ignited a viral firestorm. The view counter at the bottom of the video read 3.2 million views, and it was climbing rapidly with every refresh. The comments were overflowing with verified accounts, prominent industry figures, and major news outlets expressing their shock and congratulations. But it was not just Malik's original post that had broken the internet. I navigated to the trending topics page and gasped quietly. A top-tier, heavily respected global financial magazine had, quote, retweeted Malik's video. They had broadcast the clip to their massive global audience with a headline that read, "Elusive tech billionaire Xavier Sterling finally ties the knot in secret ceremony." The article linked below the tweet detailed Xavier's staggering net worth, his quiet philanthropic efforts, and his position as the most powerful upcoming heir to the massive Sterling conglomerate. My family had assumed I was marrying a nobody. They had assumed Xavier was just a random fling-a-man with no connections and no capital. They had abandoned me at the altar because they firmly believed that associating with my brother's doomed startup in Italy would bring them more status than attending my wedding. I stared at the headline, "Elusive tech billionaire Xavier Sterling." I slowly swiped down from the top of my screen to check my personal messages. The notification banner slid into view and my breath hitched in my throat. The irony was so rich and so perfectly timed that I almost let out a laugh. Right beneath the bold headline announcing my entrance into one of the wealthiest families in the country sat a single frantic red notification badge. 85 missed calls from Mom. I traced my thumb over the glowing number. 85 times my mother had desperately tried to reach the daughter she had gleefully discarded less than 48 hours ago. They had landed in Milan. They had turned on their phones, and they had realized with absolute crushing clarity that they had just walked out on the biggest acquisition of power and wealth their status-obsessed minds could have ever imagined. I set the phone face down on the nightstand, picked up my cup of coffee, and turned to watch the city wake up beneath us. My honeymoon had officially begun. The device vibrated against the cool marble of the nightstand, emitting a harsh, continuous buzz that shattered the tranquil quiet of our honeymoon suite. I sat near the edge of the plush mattress, the silk sheets pooling around my waist, and simply stared at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my mother's name in bold, unforgiving letters. This was call number 86. For the past 2 hours, my phone had been an absolute war zone of incoming communications But the relentless, panicked persistence of my mother was a spectacle all its own. I picked up the phone. The glass back was physically warm, overheated from processing the sheer volume of notifications and viral data traffic triggered by our wedding video. Xavier stood leaning casually against the open glass doorway of the penthouse balcony. He held a ceramic cup of dark roast coffee in one hand, the morning sunlight catching the strong, sharp lines of his profile. He did not ask who was calling. He already knew. The slight, knowing shift in his dark eyes told me everything I needed to know about the man I had just married. He was entirely unfazed by the chaos unfolding across the ocean. He was my sanctuary, entirely detached from the toxic circus my family had constructed. I swiped the green icon across the screen to accept the call and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a greeting. I relied entirely on my crisis public relations training, employing the golden rule of hostile negotiations. The person who speaks first loses the power. I simply waited in total silence. For a split second, there was nothing but the frantic, echoing acoustics of a large, highly reverberant space coming through the speaker. It sounded exactly like the grand marble-clad lobby of a luxury hotel in Milan. Then my mother's voice shattered the digital connection. She was not using her carefully modulated country club matriarch tone. She was not projecting the flawless, unbothered image she had spent decades cultivating. She was absolutely hysterical. Her words tripped over themselves in a desperate, breathless rush, pitched an octave higher than normal. "Zora! Zora! Are you there? Answer me right now!" She shrieked, the volume causing me to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. "You need to tell me what is going on right this second." I took a slow, deliberate sip of the fresh espresso Xavier had placed on the nightstand for me earlier. The rich, dark, bitter taste grounded me perfectly in the present moment. "Yes, Vivian," I replied. My voice was incredibly smooth, flat, and completely devoid of any emotional turbulence. "I am here." "Why did you not tell us?" she screamed, her voice cracking with an ugly, raw panic. "Why did you not tell us you were marrying the heir to the Sterling conglomerate? Your father's boss, Mr. Sterling, saw the video. Richard Sterling saw the video of your wedding on social media this morning. He called your father directly at the hotel. Xavier is his nephew. Xavier is Richard Sterling's nephew. Why did you hide this from your own family?" I stood up from the bed, the silk sheet slipping away, and walked slowly out onto the penthouse balcony. The warm morning breeze of the city washed over me. I looked down at the traffic moving silently streets below, feeling completely detached from the frantic woman screaming into my ear. "I hid nothing from you, Mom," I stated calmly, looking over my shoulder to share a brief, amused glance with Xavier. "You simply never bothered to ask." "But you let us leave!" Vivian gasped, her breathing ragged. "You let us board that plane thinking you were throwing your life away on a nobody. You set us up, Zora. You deliberately orchestrated this to make us look like fools in front of the most powerful man in your father's industry. Do you have any idea what position you have put your father in? Do you know how humiliating it was for Calvin to receive a personal phone call from the CEO of his company, demanding to know why his own senior vice president was vacationing in Italy instead of attending his nephew's wedding? I leaned against the glass railing of the balcony. The sheer breathtaking narcissism of her statement washed over me, but it did not sting. The armor I had built over 35 years was finally impenetrable. "I did not set you up," I replied, my tone carrying the clinical precision of a surgeon. "I invited you to my wedding. I sent you a formal invitation. I secured your seats at the rehearsal dinner. I asked you to be present for the most important milestone of my life. You made your choice. You looked at my fiancé, decided he did not possess the flashy, superficial pedigree you require, and you called him a random fling. You looked me in the eye and told me my wedding was a cheap, rushed mistake that was embarrassing the family. You chose Jamal's vacation over my marriage. You bought the tickets. You packed the bags. You walked out of the conservatory. I did not make you look like a fool, Mom. I just gave you the space to reveal exactly who you have always been." There was a sudden chaotic shuffling sound on the other end of the line. I could hear the distinct high-pitched sound of Chelsea crying in the background, her voice echoing off the Italian marble. Chelsea was loudly complaining that her anxiety was spiking, whining that her luxury baby moon was being ruined by negative energy. I could hear Jamal muttering sharp, panicked curses, frantically trying to figure out how this massive shift in power was going to affect his endless pipeline of unearned family cash. The perfect, luxurious European getaway they had weaponized against me was currently burning to the ground. Vivian fumbled with the phone, her breathing loud and erratic. "You are twisting things, Zora," she stammered, her voice dropping into a desperate, placating register. She was rapidly shifting gears, attempting to deploy the ultimate manipulation tactic. She was trying to rewrite history in real time. "We did not abandon you. We were just looking out for your heart." I actually let out a short, dry laugh. "You were looking out for my heart." "Yes," Vivian insisted, seizing onto the lie with the desperation of a drowning woman. You have to understand our perspective. You are a successful, independent African-American woman. You have built a lucrative crisis management firm. You have assets. When you suddenly announced you were marrying a man you had only known for a few weeks, a man who kept a low profile and did not flaunt his wealth, we were terrified for you. We thought he was a gold digger. We thought he was trying to take advantage of your success. We were just trying to protect you from making a massive financial and emotional mistake. We only left for Milan because we could not bear to sit there and watch you ruin your life. It was tough love, Zora. It was tough love because we care about you so deeply." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, marveling at her ability to spin a web of absolute delusion. As a PR professional, I had to respect the sheer audacity of the pivot. But as a daughter, it was the final definitive proof that my mother was entirely incapable of genuine love. "Tough love," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us. "You were protecting my financial assets by demanding Dad cut me out of the family trust if I caused a scene. You were protecting my heart by sliding a cheap plastic $50 restaurant gift card across my catering table and telling me to go buy a fast food dinner. You were looking out for me when Jamal stole a vintage bottle of champagne from my venue to drink on his flight. Do not insult my intelligence, Mom. You did not think Xavier was a gold digger. You thought he was poor, and in your world being poor is a moral failure that you refuse to associate with. But he is not poor," Vivian wailed, completely missing the point, her greed blinding her to the emotional reality of the conversation. "He is a Sterling. The Sterlings own half the commercial real estate on the eastern seaboard. They control global shipping logistics. Why did you not just tell us his last name was Sterling? If we had known who he was, we never would have boarded that plane. We would have walked you down the aisle. We would have thrown you the biggest, most extravagant wedding this city has ever seen. And that is exactly why I did not tell you," I answered. My voice dropped, losing any trace of amusement, leaving only cold, hard truth. "I did not want you to walk me down the aisle because of my husband's bank account. I wanted to walk me down the aisle because I am your daughter. I wanted you to show up for me just once without a price tag attached. But you could not do it. You literally could not bring yourself to support me unless there was a direct, transactional benefit to your social standing." "Zora, please," Vivian begged. The haughty matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a terrified woman watching her social and financial security crumble. "You have to fix this. You handle public relations for a living. You fix disasters. You need to call Mr. Sterling right now. You need to tell him that we had a severe family emergency. Tell him Chelsea had a medical crisis with the pregnancy, and we had to rush her to a specialist in Europe. Tell him we were desperate to attend the wedding, but were physically unable to be there. If you do not clear this up, your father's position at the company is going to be in serious jeopardy." I looked over at Xavier. He had walked out onto the balcony and was standing right beside me. He reached out and gently traced his knuckles down my arm, a silent anchor of support. I leaned into his touch, feeling the solid, immovable reality of the new family I had just chosen. "I do not do crisis PR for liars, Mom," I said smoothly, "and I certainly do not do it for free. You made your bed in Milan, now you get to lie in it." Before Vivian could scream another frantic plea, the audio on her end muffled sharply. There was the sound of a brief, aggressive physical struggle over the device. A heavy hand had clearly snatched the phone away from her grasp. The chaotic background noise of the Italian hotel lobby was suddenly replaced by the heavy, furious breathing of a man who was used to absolute obedience. My father had entered the chat. Zora. The single word was barked through the speaker with enough venom to strip paint from a wall. It was a command, not a greeting. My father had taken control of the device. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing echoing through the phone, a stark contrast to the polished, untouchable persona he projected in corporate boardrooms. Calvin was a man who ruled by intimidation. As a senior vice president at the Sterling conglomerate, he wielded his title like a blunt instrument, expecting absolute, unquestioning obedience from his subordinates and his family alike. For my entire life, that deep, booming voice had been used to silence my opinions, belittle my achievements, and enforce my compliance. But standing on the sunlit balcony of my penthouse honeymoon suite with the city skyline stretching out before me, his voice held absolutely no power over me. It only sounded pathetic. "You set us up to look like absolute fools," Calvin roared, completely bypassing any pretense of a normal conversation. His voice was vibrating with a level of rage I had rarely heard, fueled by raw, unfiltered panic. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? Richard Sterling called my personal cell phone 15 minutes ago. The CEO of my entire company tracked me down at my hotel in Milan. He was furious. I demanded to know why his own senior vice president boycotted his nephew's wedding to go on a luxury vacation. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. I pictured my father pacing the marble floors of his European hotel lobby, his expensive vacation completely ruined by the consequences of his own arrogance. "I did not set you up, Dad," I replied, my voice maintaining a smooth, clinical detachment. "I invited you to celebrate my marriage. You are the one who decided my wedding was beneath your social standards. You are the one who texted me from the parking lot threatening my inheritance and refusing to pay the catering bill because you wanted to upgrade Jamal's hotel suite. You deliberately hid his identity," Calvin shouted, cutting me off. "You knew exactly who Xavier was, and you kept it a secret to sabotage my career." Richard Sterling is demanding an emergency board meeting on Monday morning. He is demanding a full explanation for why my family publicly disrespected his bloodline. He was screaming now, his panic overriding any sense of decorum. "Do you understand what is happening here, Zora? My entire professional reputation is on the line because of your petty, vindictive games." I leaned against the glass railing of the balcony, swirling the remaining dark espresso in my cup. The sheer hypocrisy of his accusation was staggering. He was accusing me of playing games entirely, ignoring the decades he had spent manipulating family dynamics to favor my brother. He was terrified because the carefully constructed facade of the loving, generous patriarch had been ripped away, exposing the selfish, transactional reality underneath. "I am not the one playing games," I stated simply. "You gambled on Jamal being your golden ticket to a legacy and you lost. You thought abandoning me would have zero consequences because you never believed I was capable of securing a future without your conditional handouts. You underestimated me, and you definitely underestimated my husband." Calvin let out a sharp, breathless sound of pure frustration. "I am not going to stand here and debate family history with you." He snapped, his tone shifting into the demanding, authoritative cadence he used with his corporate staff. "You are going to fix this. You are a crisis public relations strategist. You clean up massive corporate disasters for a living. You are going to use your firm to clean up this mess right now." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by his audacity. "You want me to run a crisis management campaign for you?" "Yes," Calvin barked. "You need to issue an official PR statement to the press and to the Sterling Conglomerate Executive Board immediately. You will draft a release stating that Vivian, Jamal, Chelsea, and I were struck by a sudden violent illness. You will say it was severe food poisoning from the rehearsal dinner venue, or better yet, a severe medical emergency regarding Chelsea's pregnancy that required an immediate private medical evacuation to a specialist in Europe. You will make it sound absolutely terrifying and completely unavoidable. You will tell Richard Sterling that we were desperate to be at the ceremony, but were physically incapacitated." I actually let out a short, genuine laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that carried across the balcony. As a public relations professional, his proposed strategy was not just unethical, it was laughably incompetent. "You cannot be serious," I said, shaking my head. "You want me to lie to a billionaire CEO and the global financial press claiming you were on a medical evacuation flight. It is your job to spin the narrative, Calvin yelled, his desperation making him sloppy. Just write the statement and release it to your media contacts. Make them believe it. I cannot spin a narrative when your own golden child has already supplied the counter-evidence, I explained, dropping my voice into a flat, instructive tone. A crisis PR statement claiming you were violently ill is completely useless when Chelsea has already posted a highly filtered geotagged photograph of herself and Jamal sipping mimosas in a first-class airline cabin. She literally used the hashtag escaping cheap weddings for luxury. The digital footprint is permanent, Dad. The internet has the receipts. If I put out a statement claiming a medical emergency, the financial press will cross-reference it with her social media feed in less than 5 seconds. They will expose the lie and you will look infinitely worse. You will not just look like a bad father, you will look like a pathetic, incompetent liar. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. The escape route he had demanded was completely blocked by the sheer arrogance of the daughter-in-law he had prioritized over me. When Calvin finally spoke again, his voice was trembling with a dark, uncontrollable rage. He had realized that he could not charm or command his way out of this disaster, so he reverted to his oldest, most reliable weapon: absolute financial terror. Listen to me very carefully, Zora. Calvin hissed, his words slow and dripping with malice. I am a senior vice president. I built the logistics division of that company from the ground up. I have connections in every major corporate boardroom in this country. If you do not fix this by tomorrow morning, if you do not find a way to get Richard Sterling off my back and secure my position, I will destroy you. I stood perfectly still, my grip tightening slightly on the ceramic coffee cup. I am cutting you off forever! Calvin screamed, his voice breaking with furious intensity. I will remove you from the family trust. I will disinherit you completely. But I will not stop there. I will use every single industry connection I have to blacklist your public relations agency. I will tell every corporate client you have that you are untrustworthy, volatile, and vindictive. I will bleed your firm dry until you have to close your doors. I will take your business down with me, Zora. Do not test me. His threats echoed through the speaker of the phone loud enough that Xavier, who was standing just a few feet away, heard every single word. For years, that exact threat had kept me in line. The fear of losing my firm, the business I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears, had forced me to swallow my pride and accept their abuse. But standing in the sunlight of my honeymoon suite, married to a man who truly saw my worth, the threat felt completely empty. It was the desperate thrashing of a cornered animal. Before I could formulate a response, I felt a warm, strong hand gently envelop mine. Xavier stepped smoothly into my personal space. His presence was a solid grounding force. He did not look angry, he did not look panicked. He possessed the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who held absolute power and knew exactly how to use it. Xavier smoothly took the phone from my hand. He did not ask for permission. He simply lifted the device to his own ear, his dark eyes locked onto mine, offering a silent promise of complete protection. Calvin, Xavier said. His voice was pure steel. It was not raised, but it carried a heavy, resonant authority that demanded immediate, absolute silence. It was the voice of a man who moved global markets, speaking to a man who was about to lose everything. The frantic breathing on the other end of the line stopped instantly. My father, the great corporate bully, was suddenly rendered completely mute by the sound of his boss's nephew. You are not going to blacklist my wife's agency, Xavier continued, his tone smooth and devastatingly precise. You are not going to threaten her inheritance, and you are certainly never going to speak to her in that tone of voice ever again. You seem to be laboring under the delusion that you still have leverage in this situation. You do not. Xavier paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to let the absolute dread settle into my father's bones. You are demanding that Zora save your job, Xavier stated quietly. But you are missing a critical piece of information, Calvin. You do not have a job to lose anymore. Check your email. I did not hand the device back to me. Instead, he set it face down on the small glass table on the balcony and pulled me into his arms. The silence that followed was not heavy or anxious. It was the lightest, most exquisite quiet I had ever experienced in my entire life. My father was gone. His toxic, thundering voice had been severed from my reality with a single tap of a screen. We did not discuss Calvin or Vivian for the remainder of our honeymoon. We spent our days swimming in the warm, azure waters, and our nights dining under the stars, completely insulated from the frantic implosion of my biological family. But while Xavier and I were anchored in a sanctuary of our own making, my parents were living through a brutal, self-inflicted nightmare. I learned the precise details of their descent during our private flight back to the United States. We were seated in the luxurious leather cabin of Xavier's personal jet cruising at 40,000 feet. Xavier handed me a sleek, encrypted tablet containing a briefing from his global security team. The corporate intelligence network at the Sterling conglomerate was vast and terrifyingly efficient. Reading the concise bullet points, I discovered exactly how ruthless Calvin and Vivian had become when their wealth and social standing were genuinely threatened. When the reality of Calvin's termination email had finally set in, the illusion of their tight-knit, loving family vanished instantly. My parents had abandoned their golden boy in the middle of Milan without a second thought. Desperate to afford exorbitant last-minute flights back to the United States to salvage Calvin's career, they needed immediate liquid capital. As the investigation expanded, Sterling Conglomerate's compliance team suspended the unauthorized corporate cards that had been issued for Jamal and Chelsea's personal expenses. My parents left my 38-year-old brother and his heavily pregnant, supposedly anxiety-ridden wife completely stranded in a foreign country. Jamal's cards bounced at the hotel concierge desk. Chelsea's highly curated baby moon shattered into a humiliating logistical nightmare. It was a brilliant, undeniable display of survival of the fittest. My parents did not care about Jamal's generational legacy anymore. They did not care about Chelsea's fragile mental health. They only cared about saving their own social and financial standing. The report noted that Calvin had burned through a significant amount of his remaining corporate leverage and personal favors just to track Xavier's private flight itinerary. They had positioned themselves for a desperate ambush upon our return. When our jet touched down at the private aviation terminal, the cabin door opened to a rush of crisp, cool air. I stepped onto the tarmac, my hand resting comfortably in Xavier's. The private lounge was usually a sanctuary of quiet luxury, heavily insulated from the noise and chaos of commercial airports. It was a place where billionaires and dignitaries could travel in absolute discretion. But as the sliding glass doors parted to grant us entry, that tranquil atmosphere shattered completely. Calvin and Vivian were waiting right in the center of the pristine marble-clad lobby. They looked entirely out of place. My mother, usually a picture of perfectly tailored country club elegance, appeared disheveled and frantic. Her designer clothes were deeply wrinkled from a cramped, uncomfortable coach flight, and her hair lacked its usual flawless volume. My father looked pale, his posture rigid with a dangerous, simmering panic. He was pacing back and forth, clutching a leather briefcase, as if it were a physical life preserver. The moment the automatic doors clicked shut behind us, Vivian launched into her performance. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, the exact kind of public theatrical display she used whenever she needed to rewrite reality and force people into compliance. "Oh, my beautiful girl," Vivian wailed. Her voice was pitched loudly, purposefully, designed to capture the attention of the terminal staff, the concierge desk, and the private security personnel stationed around the room. She threw her hands in the air, her face contorting into a mask of overwhelming, tearful joy. She rushed forward, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished floor with her arms outstretched, as if she intended to sweep both Xavier and me into a desperate, loving embrace. "My sweet children, we were so worried about you," she cried out, her voice echoing sharply. "We missed you so much." My crisis public relations instincts engaged before I even took a breath. I recognized the tactic instantly. She was trying to force a public reconciliation, manufacturing a touching family reunion in front of witnesses to trap us into social compliance. She thought she could hug her way out of the devastation she had caused. She wanted to force Xavier to accept her as a grieving, loving mother, rather than the woman who had mocked him and abandoned his bride. I did not back away, but I absolutely did not open my arms. I stepped smoothly in front of Zir, establishing a physical barricade between my billionaire husband and my frantic mother. I raised my right hand in a sharp, flat gesture, signaling an immediate halt. At the exact same time, I caught the eye of the lead security agent standing near the exit. I gave him a subtle, decisive nod. Two large men in dark suits stepped forward, instantly moving with quiet, terrifying speed. They positioned themselves smoothly between Vivian and me, acting as an impenetrable human wall. Vivian collided with the reality of our security detail, her fake tears drying up instantly as she stumbled backward in shock. She looked up at the broad shoulders of the security guards, her mouth falling open in genuine disbelief. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was calm and conversational, but it carried across the lobby with absolute finality. "And do not perform for the terminal staff. We all know exactly why you are here, and it has absolutely nothing to do with missing your daughter." Vivian looked around the lobby, realizing her audience was completely unmoved by her tears. The security guards did not flinch. The concierge continued typing quietly at her desk. Xavier simply watched Vivian with an expression of mild clinical disgust. Her emotional extortion had failed spectacularly to secure a single ounce of leverage. Seeing that his wife's theatrical display had achieved nothing, Calvin lost the last shred of his composure. The polished, untouchable corporate executive vanished, completely replaced by a cornered, desperate man who felt his entire empire slipping through his fingers. He surged forward, dropping his leather briefcase heavily onto the marble floor. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, the veins in his neck standing out in sharp relief. The security detail shifted immediately to block his path, one of the guards placing a firm, unyielding hand directly on Calvin's chest to halt his forward momentum. "Zora, call them off right now," Calvin commanded. He tried to project his usual booming authority, but his voice cracked with raw, unfiltered panic. I was sweating heavily, his usually pristine suit hanging awkwardly on his frame. "Tell these men to step aside. I am your father, and I demand that you speak to me with respect. You will not humiliate us in public like this." I looked at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. "You lost the right to demand anything from me when you texted me financial threats from a parking lot on the eve of my wedding," I replied smoothly. "You are trespassing in a private terminal, Calvin. Say what you came to say, or I will have you removed for harassment. I have zero issues turning this into a police matter." The lack of the word. Dad hit him like a physical blow, but his sheer, unadulterated arrogance overrode his shock. He leaned forward, straining against the invisible boundary the security team enforced. His eyes were wild, darting frantically between me and Xavier. "You listen to me," Calvin snarled, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "I am a senior VP. I built that company. I have dedicated 2 decades of my life to building a flawless corporate reputation. You will not let some boy you met 2 weeks ago destroy my life over a family misunderstanding." The words tumbled out of his mouth in a furious, desperate rush. A family misunderstanding. That was how he categorized decades of financial manipulation, emotional neglect, and blatant favoritism. To Calvin, draining my college fund to finance Jamal's failures was just business. Prioritizing my brother's luxury vacation over my wedding was just a minor scheduling conflict. To him, my entire existence was merely a footnote to his grand, unblemished corporate legacy. And Xavier, a man who possessed more wealth and influence than Calvin could ever comprehend, was just a boy who had inconvenienced him. "I am not going to let this happen." Calvin continued, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the high ceilings of the terminal. "You are going to fix this narrative today, Zora. You are going to get on the phone with Richard Sterling and explain that this was a private internal miscommunication. You will tell him that Xavier overreacted to a minor scheduling conflict. You will restore my standing with the board. I will not lose my empire because of your petty vindictive tantrum. I will not let you ruin everything I have worked for just because you are jealous of your brother." I was panting heavily now, his chest heaving as he stared at me, waiting for me to submit. He was waiting for the old Zora, the crisis manager, who always cleaned up the family messes, to step in and save him from the consequences of his own disastrous actions. He truly believed that if he yelled loud enough, the natural order of his universe would be restored. Calvin was panting heavily, his chest heaving as he demanded that I fix his ruined life before the echoes of his booming, toxic voice could even fade against the polished glass of the private terminal walls. Xavier finally moved. He did not rush. He did not display a single ounce of the frantic, sweaty desperation that was currently consuming my father. Xavier simply stepped forward, sliding his tall, broad frame directly between Calvin and me. It was a fluid, highly protective maneuver that completely severed my father's line of sight. Calvin found himself staring directly into the cold, unyielding gaze of a man who possessed the exact kind of untouchable generational power he had spent his entire adult life trying to mimic. Calvin instinctively took a half-step backward. His loud, commanding bravado evaporated the second he met Xavier's dark eyes. The sheer physical disparity between the two men was striking. Calvin was red-faced, trembling, and wearing a wrinkled suit that smelled of stale airplane air and desperate anxiety. Xavier was a picture of absolute bespoke perfection, projecting a quiet, lethal authority that required zero raised voices to enforce. "You have a terrible habit of misdirecting your anger," Calvin Xavier said. His voice was smooth, resonant, and pitched at a low volume that forced everyone in the private lounge to hold their breath just to hear him. "You are standing here shouting at me, blaming me for a ruined reputation and a lost corporate empire. But you are giving me far too much credit in this scenario. I did not destroy your career, Calvin. You did. Zora simply refused to help you hide what you had already done." I stepped out from behind Xavier, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with my husband. My father looked at me, his brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. The reality of the situation was entirely beyond his comprehension. He still saw me as the obedient little daughter, the quiet, compliant fixer who existed solely to sweep up the messes he and Jamal left behind. He could not fathom a universe where I was the architect of his total professional annihilation. I reached into the sleek leather travel tote I had carried off the jet. My fingers brushed past my palette and closed around a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was not a standard corporate folder. It was bound with a thick, dark cord and sealed with a heavy crimson wax stamp bearing the official crest of my crisis management firm. I pulled it out and held it in my hands. The physical weight of the dossier was substantial. It represented 4 weeks of independent forensic investigation, combined with the crisis analysis my firm had built around the verified findings. I stepped forward and held the envelope out to my father. Calvin did not take it. He stared at the red wax seal as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. When he refused to take the document, I simply opened my fingers and let it drop. The heavy envelope hit the pristine marble floor with a resounding, satisfying slap. It landed right next to his discarded, scuffed leather briefcase. "What is this?" Calvin whispered, his voice completely stripped of its former thundering volume. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him, feeling an incredible surge of professional and personal clarity. "You love to control the narrative, Dad," I said, calmly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You told Mom that Xavier was just a random boy I met 2 weeks ago. You convinced yourself that I stumbled into a rushed, desperate romance because I was so incredibly lonely and starved for basic affection. But you forgot what I actually do for a living. I am a crisis public relations strategist. I do not stumble into anything. Every single move I make is calculated, vetted, and highly purposeful." I watched Calvin's throat bob as he swallowed hard. Xavier did not just wander into a coffee shop and ask for my number. I continued, my voice carrying the steady rhythm of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. He did not bump into me on the street. We met in a secure, windowless boardroom on the top floor of the Sterling conglomerate headquarters exactly 1 month ago. My firm was not hired to plan a wedding. We were retained under a strict ironclad non-disclosure agreement by Richard Sterling himself. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, the diamond rings on her fingers trembling violently. She looked at Xavier, then at me, the horrific realization slowly beginning to dawn on her carefully preserved features. The socialite matriarch was finally putting the pieces together. Richard Sterling brought my team in because the conglomerate was facing a massive, unprecedented media crisis, I explained, ensuring my voice carried to the security guards who were all watching in stunned silence. The corporate accounting division flagged a series of highly suspicious, irregular vendor payments originating from the legitimately bleeding out of the company accounts and vanishing into dummy corporations. The financial press was already sniffing around the discrepancies. A massive catastrophic leak was imminent. Richard needed an external crisis communications team to contain the media risk, while an independent forensic accounting and legal team investigated the financial irregularities. My firm was retained to manage the public narrative surrounding the investigation. When the forensic team discovered that the transactions led directly to my father's division, I immediately disclosed my relationship and removed myself from any decision involving the financial investigation itself. I kept my eyes locked on Calvin. The deep red flush that had colored his face just moments ago completely drained away, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray. His jaw hung slightly open. He was a man watching a firing squad load their rifles. "You brought me in to fix the PR leak," Xavier added, his tone conversational but laced with venom. But Zora is entirely too brilliant to just treat the public symptoms. She insisted on finding the actual source of the corporate infection. When the independent forensic team began mapping the financial irregularities, my crisis team received access to the verified findings necessary to assess the company's reputational exposure. I did not conduct the financial audit myself. I worked from evidence that had already been preserved and authenticated by the investigators. I needed to know exactly what the journalists were going to find when they inevitably dug into the logistics department. I expected to find a few careless accounting errors. I expected to find a mid-level manager making sloppy, desperate mistakes with expense reports. I certainly did not expect the independent forensic team to trace the authorization trail back to my own father's executive credentials and digital approvals. "That is a lie," Calvin choked out. The denial was an automatic knee-jerk reaction, but his voice was completely hollow. He was shaking his head, taking a small, unsteady step backward away from the dossier. "You are lying. You fabricated this because you are angry about the wedding. You are just a vindictive, jealous girl trying to get back at your brother. No one is going to believe you. I have 20 years of loyal, flawless service to that company. I did not fabricate the bank routing numbers." I stated, my voice slicing effortlessly through his pathetic, transparent defense. "I did not fabricate the shell companies registered under Jamal's name in the state of Delaware. I did not fabricate the fact that the Sterling conglomerate's logistics budget has been secretly funding every single one of Jamal's failed tech startups for the past 4 years." Calvin squeezed his eyes shut as if refusing to look at me would somehow alter the reality of his crimes. "And I certainly did not fabricate the massive, untraceable corporate payments that magically covered the costs of Chelsea's endless, extravagant anxiety wellness retreats in the Swiss Alps." I pushed forward, refusing to grant him an inch of mercy. "You used the corporate vault as your personal family piggy bank, Dad. You stole from the very company you swore to protect just to maintain the illusion that Jamal was a successful innovator. You funded his golden legacy with embezzled cash, and you expected me to clean up the public messes for free." Vivian let out a loud, piercing sob. She collapsed against one of the tall marble pillars in the terminal lobby, clutching her designer handbag to her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from the incoming destruction. She slid down the cool stone until she was sitting on the floor, her perfectly curated image entirely shattered. She finally understood why Jamal and Chelsea's credit cards had bounced at the hotel in Milan. The endless pipeline of unearned stolen cash had been severed completely. The golden child was not a brilliant entrepreneur. He was a parasite, and Calvin was the corrupt host feeding him with stolen corporate funds. I looked down at the wax-sealed dossier on the floor, then brought my gaze back up to meet my father's terrified wide eyes. "You demanded that I get on the phone with Richard Sterling and fix your narrative," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded total, absolute attention. "You wanted me to use my professional reputation to lie to the press and save your job. You threatened to destroy my firm if I did not comply, but you are incredibly late to the party." Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely, entirely broken. The aggressive, domineering patriarch had been reduced to a trembling shell of a man, realizing that his entire empire was built on sand, and I was the ocean coming to wash it all away. I stepped back, sliding my hand effortlessly back into Xavier's waiting palm. I felt the warm, reassuring weight of his wedding ring against my skin. The independent forensic team was auditing your department, Dad, I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow. And their verified findings exposed exactly how you have been funding Jamal's legacy. Mr. Sterling did not just see the viral video of our wedding yesterday. He had already received the full unredacted forensic report from the investigators before I ever stepped off that plane. The following Monday, the Sterling conglomerate convened a formal board review of Calvin's termination and the independent forensic findings. Calvin was allowed to attend with counsel and respond to the allegations before the company finalized its internal disciplinary actions. Calvin stood at the opposite end of the sprawling mahogany table, his chest heaving as the final desperate echoes of his accusations rang through the executive boardroom. He had just spent 5 minutes attempting to assassinate my character in front of the most powerful corporate leaders in the country. He had pointed a trembling finger at me, demanding that I be escorted from the building by security. He had spun a frantic, wildly fictitious narrative claiming that I was a bitter, jealous daughter who had fabricated a financial audit purely out of spite because I envied my brother Jamal. He demanded his termination be reversed immediately. He expected the board to side with their veteran senior vice president over a newly hired public relations consultant. I did not interrupt him while he shouted. I did not defend myself against his absurd claims of sibling jealousy. In my line of work, engaging with a frantic, hostile target only validates their hysteria. You do not argue with a man who is actively digging his own grave. You simply hand him a larger shovel. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, situated directly to the right of Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of the Sterling conglomerate. I wore a tailored slate gray suit, my posture impeccably straight, my expression wiped completely clean of any familial emotion. I was not Calvin's daughter in this room. I was the lead external crisis communications advisor for a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and I was about to present the verified findings that had destroyed his carefully constructed narrative. When Calvin finally ran out of breath, I did not raise my voice. I simply reached forward and tapped the glowing screen of the sleek digital tablet resting on the table in front of me. The massive state-of-the-art presentation screen, dominating the back wall of the boardroom, immediately illuminated. The sudden bright light cast a harsh clinical glow over Calvin's sweating face. I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket, moving with a slow, deliberate calm that commanded the absolute attention of every single executive seated at the table. Gentlemen, I began, my voice smooth, resonant, and carrying the undeniable weight of empirical fact. The financial findings I am presenting today were independently authenticated by the company's forensic accountants and outside counsel. My role is to explain what those verified facts mean for the company's public exposure, executive credibility, and reputational risk. What we are dealing with today is not a family dispute. It is a highly calculated, sustained, and systemic breach of corporate fiduciary duty. I tapped my tablet again, and a complex, meticulously structured financial timeline appeared on the massive screen. It was color-coded, annotated, and cross-referenced with official bank routing numbers. A soft collective murmur rippled through the boardroom as the executives leaned forward to examine the independently authenticated findings I had organized into a clear crisis timeline for the board. According to the independently verified forensic findings, over the past 4 years, the logistics division under Calvin's direct supervision authorized a series of recurring high-value vendor payments. I explained, pacing slowly, alongside the projected timeline. These payments were ostensibly for international freight consulting and supply chain optimization software. However, a standard forensic trace quickly revealed that none of these vendors actually exist. They are shell corporations. I tapped the screen and the graphics zoomed in on a specific cluster of transactions. The logos of Jamal's various failed startups appeared on the screen side by side with the Sterling conglomerate's outgoing payment ledgers. The funds were routed through a series of offshore holding accounts before being deposited directly into 3 domestic limited liability companies. I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy. All three of these entities are registered in the state of Delaware. All three are solely owned and operated by Jamal. Calvin has been systematically siphoning corporate operating budgets to artificially inflate the valuation of his son's non-existent tech enterprises. I used your profits to play venture capitalist for a man who has never brought a single viable product to market. Calvin gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He looked around the room, seeking an ally among the executives he had golfed with and dined with for 2 decades. But the men seated at the table were staring at the screen with cold, hard calculation. They were investors, and Calvin had stolen their money. But the embezzlement did not stop at corporate ventures. I pushed forward, tapping the screen to bring up the next slide. I was not going to give him a single second to formulate a new lie. It seems the stolen logistics funds were also utilized to finance personal luxury expenses. The screen shifted, displaying a series of exorbitant invoices from exclusive elite wellness clinics scattered across the Swiss Alps and the southern coast of France. The billing statements were explicit. Over $600,000 in stolen corporate capital was redirected to pay for anxiety wellness retreats and luxury baby moons for Jamal's wife Chelsea. I stated, letting the sheer absurdity of the expenditure hang heavily in the silent boardroom. Calvin disguised these international spa vacations as executive stress management seminars. He authorized the payments using his highest-level security clearance, bypassing the standard accounting safeguards entirely. "That is a fabrication!" Calvin suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as he slammed his fist onto the table. The loud, sudden noise made several board members flinch, but I did not even blink. She is manipulating the data. She is twisting legitimate departmental expenses to ruin me. Richard, you have known me for 20 years. You know my character. I am a man of integrity. I built that division. I let him finish his desperate plea. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute desperation of his lie to settle over the room. "In crisis public relations," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register, "we are trained to assess every possible liability." When I was brought in to lock down the media leaks regarding these financial discrepancies, I had to evaluate the stability of the key players involved. I needed to know if the senior vice president of logistics was a rational actor or a volatile threat to the company's public image. I tapped my tablet one final time. I believe this audio file will provide the board with a comprehensive understanding of Calvin's true character and his definition of integrity. I did not need to explain the context. I simply pressed play. The preserved recording of my phone conversation with Calvin, while he was standing in the Italian hotel lobby, played over the pristine surround sound speakers of the corporate boardroom. The quality was crystal clear. His deep, booming voice filled the large room, stripped of all its polished corporate charm, revealing the raw, toxic, abusive bully underneath. "If you do not fix this by tomorrow morning, if you do not find a way to get Richard Sterling off my back and secure my position, I will destroy you," Calvin's recorded voice roared from the speakers. The sheer vitriol and malice in the audio caused several executives to physically recoil in their chairs. "I am cutting you off forever. I will remove you from the family trust. I will disinherit you completely. But I will not stop there. I will use every single industry connection I have to blacklist your public relations agency. I will tell every corporate client you have that you are untrustworthy, volatile, and vindictive. I will bleed your firm dry until you have to close your doors. I will take your business down with me, Zora. Do not test me." The recording ended with a sharp digital click. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a room where a man's entire life had just been formally and legally dismantled. The board members were horrified. These were men of intense power and influence, and they were looking at Calvin as if he were a diseased animal that had wandered into their sanctuary. To steal from the company was a crime. To aggressively threaten to destroy an independent business out of pure spite and panic was a liability they would never tolerate. Calvin had exposed himself not just as a thief, but as a reckless, volatile liability who was entirely out of control. Calvin stood frozen at the end of the table. His face was a sickly grayish pale, His mouth hung open, but there were no more lies left to spin. No amount of shouting or demanding could undo the empirical evidence displayed on the screen behind me. No amount of false charm could erase the sound of his own abusive voice threatening to ruin his own daughter to save his stolen empire. He was entirely stripped of his power, his title, and his false legacy. I calmly locked my tablet and sat back down in my leather chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. My execution was flawless. Richard Sterling, the billionaire CEO, who had remained perfectly silent throughout my entire presentation, slowly turned his head. He looked at Calvin with a quiet, absolute disgust that was far more devastating than any shouted reprimand. Richard did not yell. He did not berate his former senior vice president. He simply dismissed his existence entirely. Richard turned away from the trembling, broken man at the end of the table and looked directly at me. His expression was calm, respectful, and deeply appreciative of the surgical precision I had just displayed. "The audit is bulletproof, Zora," Richard said, his voice echoing clearly in the dead silent boardroom. "What do you recommend we do with his shares and his pension?" I looked directly into Richard Sterling's eyes. The billionaire CEO was not asking for my opinion as a professional courtesy. He was testing the absolute limits of my crisis management protocol to see if I possessed the ruthlessness required to protect his empire. I did not hesitate for a single second. "I recommend that the board terminate him for cause, suspend any unpaid incentive compensation, invoke every applicable clawback provision in his executive agreement, and preserve the company's civil claims against assets connected to the missing funds. The forensic dossier should then be turned over to the appropriate authorities, so any restitution, forfeiture, or criminal penalties can be handled through the legal process." Calvin let out a strangled, horrific sound. He lunged toward the mahogany table, his hands grasping at the polished wood, as if he could physically hold on to his vanishing career. But two corporate security guards materialized from the shadows of the boardroom. They grabbed him by the arms, halting his movement completely. The man who had terrorized me for 35 years, who had bullied me and threatened my livelihood, was dragged out of the room. He kicked and shouted, demanding that someone listen to him, pleading for his legacy, until the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind him. The severance was absolute and immediate. The other executives in the room did not even blink, returning their attention to their tablets, as if a minor pest had just been swatted away. The fallout was instantaneous. By the time Calvin's termination was formally reviewed, the corporate finance department had already suspended every unauthorized account connected to the logistics division. That included the elite black cards Calvin had illegally issued to my brother. Over in Milan, Italy, the golden child was currently experiencing a profound and devastating reality check. Through the network of Xavier's corporate security team, I received a highly detailed play-by-play of the exact moment Jamal's unearned empire collapsed. Jamal and Chelsea had just finished a lavish multi-course truffle-tasting lunch at a five-star hotel restaurant. They were sitting on a sunlit terrace, completely oblivious to the fact that their primary source of income had just been escorted out of a corporate building by armed guards. When the waiter presented the exorbitant bill, Jamal casually tossed down his corporate credit card, expecting the usual seamless transaction. A few minutes later, the hotel concierge approached their table. The concierge was flanked by the restaurant manager and a very polite but unyielding hotel security officer. The card had declined. Jamal, arrogant and deeply entitled, attempted to bully the staff. He demanded they run the card again, loudly claiming he was a wealthy tech founder and that their machine must be broken. He threw a massive, embarrassing tantrum in the middle of the luxury dining room, demanding respect. The concierge calmly informed him that not only had the card declined, but the issuing bank had flagged the account for fraudulent activity. The hotel demanded immediate alternative payment for the lunch and the remaining balance on their luxury penthouse suite. Jamal frantically pulled out his personal credit cards. They were all maxed out from years of irresponsible spending. Chelsea began to panic, demanding that Jamal call Calvin to fix the situation. But Calvin was currently sitting on the curb outside the Sterling conglomerate headquarters with a cardboard box of his office supplies and no cell phone service because his corporate phone had been confiscated. Humiliated, publicly disgraced, and completely broke, Jamal and Chelsea were forced to pack their designer bags and vacate the premises immediately. They had to beg a distant relative on Chelsea's side for a microloan just to afford two miserable cramped middle-seat coach tickets on a budget airline back to the United States. The luxurious, glamorous baby moon. My parents had prioritized over my wedding, ended with my brother weeping in a crowded European airport terminal while eating stale vending machine food. The stark contrast between their smug departure and their pathetic return was a masterpiece of poetic justice. But the toxicity of my family did not simply evaporate when their funding was cut. It mutated into desperate, vicious retaliation. The moment Jamal and Chelsea landed back in the States, they realized the endless cash flow was permanently severed. Jamal was completely furious. He could not accept that his failures were his own. He needed someone to blame, and I was his favorite target. He manipulated my mother using her desperate need to maintain the family illusion. He convinced Vivian to drain the very last of her legitimate personal savings accounts. I used her retirement funds to hire a sleazy, aggressive defense attorney who operated out of a rundown strip mall. 3 days after the boardroom reckoning, a process server showed up at my public relations firm. He handed me a thick stack of legal documents. Jamal was actually attempting to sue me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit claimed that I had maliciously fabricated the financial audit out of deep-seated sibling jealousy. He wanted $10 million in damages, claiming my actions had destroyed his tech startup and ruined his personal reputation in the business community. It was a laughable, completely frivolous lawsuit, but it was designed to be a public nuisance. Jamal wanted to drag my name through the mud, hoping I would pay him a quiet settlement just to make him go away and protect my new marriage. He severely underestimated how much I enjoy dismantling a poorly constructed legal threat. While Jamal tried to weaponize the legal system, Chelsea took her grievances to the court of public opinion. She could not handle the sudden loss of her wealthy socialite persona. She needed attention, and she needed a villain. Chelsea went live on her primary social media accounts. She set up her camera in the living room of my parents' house wearing an oversized sweater and no makeup to maximize the sympathetic aesthetic. She hit record and began to sob hysterically for her followers. In the video, Chelsea completely weaponized the angry, aggressive woman trope against me. She cried into the camera, claiming that I was a bitter, spiteful sister-in-law who had ruthlessly destroyed her loving family. She told her followers that I had orchestrated a massive corporate conspiracy simply because I was jealous that my parents loved Jamal more than me. She sobbed about how I had ruined her peaceful baby moon, how the stress had endangered her pregnancy, and how I was a cold, unfeeling monster who had stolen her husband's legitimate business funds out of pure spite. She painted herself as a fragile, innocent victim who was being terrorized by a cruel, vindictive African-American woman. Chelsea begged her followers to share the video, hoping to ignite a digital witch hunt against my public relations agency. My staff immediately flagged the video as it began to gain traction across various social media platforms. My senior directors gathered in my office looking concerned as the view count on Chelsea's livestream continued to climb. They asked me if we needed to draft a cease and desist letter or file an immediate injunction against her accounts to stop the spread of the defamatory video. I sat at my desk watching Chelsea wipe away her manufactured tears on the screen. She was reciting a script of victimhood that my family had perfected over decades. She truly believed that crying on the internet would somehow undo a federal embezzlement investigation. She thought she could manipulate the public into bullying me into submission. I did not feel threatened. I felt a deep, profound sense of professional anticipation. They had just handed me the exact tools I needed to permanently dismantle their public facade. I looked up at my team and smiled a sharp, confident smile. I sat at the head of my polished conference table watching my sister-in-law sob on the large digital display. Chelsea was performing the role of the fragile victim with a terrifying level of dedication. She weaponized her tears, seamlessly playing into deeply ingrained societal biases to paint me as the aggressive, hostile black woman who was terrorizing her innocent family out of pure vindictive jealousy. My senior directors sat around the room looking at me with genuine professional concern. They understood the optics. They knew exactly how easily the internet could rally behind a weeping pregnant white woman holding a designer tissue and claiming emotional distress. They suggested we file an immediate cease and desist order or deploy a defensive counter-statement defending my character and my marriage to Xavier. I raised my hand, silencing the room completely. I did not feel a single trace of panic or anxiety. In fact, I felt a profound sense of professional anticipation. Chelsea had just made a fatal strategic error. She had taken a localized corporate embezzlement scandal and dragged it directly into the national spotlight. She had built a massive digital stage, demanded the public's attention, and handed me the microphone. I was not going to send a cease and desist. I was going to use the audience she had so graciously gathered to completely annihilate her husband's fraudulent empire. You do not fight manufactured emotion with defensive emotion. If I went online and tried to explain the toxic family dynamics or defended my character, it would only legitimize her false narrative. In crisis public relations, you fight hysteria with empirical, devastating fact. I instructed my team to ignore Chelsea's social media accounts entirely. We were not going to engage in a petty digital war in the comment sections. Instead, I drafted a single legally airtight press release. I collaborated directly with the legal department at the Sterling conglomerate and coordinated the precise timing with the federal authorities who were already processing the evidence from my forensic audit. The press release was a masterpiece of corporate transparency. It did not mention family drama. It did not mention weddings or lavish baby moons in Milan. It read like a sterile clinical financial report. The headline simply stated that the Sterling conglomerate was cooperating fully with federal investigators regarding more than $12 million in suspected misappropriated corporate funds. But the true lethal power of the press release lay in the fourth paragraph. Working directly with outside counsel, we disclosed only information supported by the company's verified internal findings and records that could legally be released. The statement identified the 3 Delaware-based limited liability companies linked to the disputed transfers and confirmed that Jamal was listed in corporate records as the owner or controlling party of those entities. We detailed how the disputed corporate transfers had been routed toward luxury international expenses and business entities connected to Jamal. Once the draft was reviewed and authorized by Richard Sterling, I did not post it to a social media timeline. I released it directly to the major financial wire services. I sent it to the Wall Street Journal, to Forbes, and to the exact same elite business reporters who had been captivated by my wedding video just days prior. I pressed the send button and sat back to watch the dominoes fall. The timing was absolutely flawless. Chelsea's tearful video had pushed her name and Jamal's startup into the trending algorithms across multiple platforms. The financial press algorithms immediately linked her viral rant with the breaking news wire from the Sterling conglomerate. Within 30 minutes, every major news outlet had published the story. The juxtaposition was brutal and instantaneous. In one browser tab, Chelsea was weeping about my supposed jealousy. In the adjacent tab, federal financial regulators were confirming that her husband was the primary beneficiary of a massive corporate embezzlement ring orchestrated by his own father. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving. The internet has a very low tolerance for people who cry about being victimized while actively spending millions of dollars of stolen money on luxury European vacations. The comments on Chelsea's video shifted from sympathetic to viciously mocking in a matter of minutes. Users began analyzing her designer background, tagging the federal authorities, and demanding to know if her tears were funded by the Sterling conglomerate's logistics budget. But the digital humiliation was only the first wave. The legal repercussions moved with the terrifying speed of federal jurisdiction. As the investigation expanded, federal prosecutors sought and obtained a court-authorized order restricting accounts tied to the alleged scheme while the financial evidence was reviewed. By 2:00 in the afternoon, the banks received the federal orders. The accounts and assets specifically identified in the court order were restricted. Several of Jamal's business accounts, personal accounts connected to the disputed transfers and the offshore holdings established through the scheme, were temporarily locked while the investigation continued. Jamal could not buy a cup of coffee, much less finance a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against me. Several weeks later, the reality of their total financial collapse became impossible to ignore. Despite his restricted assets, Jamal had foolishly insisted on pursuing the defamation case, and his attorney requested an early settlement conference in a desperate attempt to pressure me into paying him. He genuinely believed he could still intimidate me into a quick cash settlement using his usual bluster and arrogance. I did not attend the settlement conference in person. I sent my lead corporate attorney to handle the disposal of the case while I watched the proceedings through a secure remote video link from the comfort of my office. Jamal and Chelsea were seated at a polished conference table across from my lawyer. Jamal looked completely exhausted, sweating heavily through a rumpled suit that had clearly not been tailored recently. Chelsea sat beside him, glaring at the camera lens as if her sheer willpower could force me to write them a check. My attorney did not mince words. He calmly informed the neutral settlement facilitator that not only was the lawsuit entirely baseless, but the plaintiff was currently under active federal investigation for receiving stolen corporate funds. He then slid a freshly printed document across the table. It was a formal notice confirming that a federal court had temporarily restricted specified accounts connected to Jamal while the financial investigation continued. Jamal stared at the paper. The last vestige of his arrogant golden boy persona simply dissolved into thin air. He picked up the document, his hands shaking violently as he read the federal seal. He turned to Chelsea, his voice cracking as he tried to explain that they had absolutely zero access to capital. They could not pay their mortgage. They could not pay the sleazy lawyer sitting next to them, who immediately began packing his briefcase the second he heard the word frozen. They were completely and totally broke. I watched through the high-definition video feed as Chelsea processed the information. She did not reach out to comfort her husband. She did not offer words of support or promise that they would weather this terrible storm together. Her eyes scanned the federal document, and her expression shifted from manufactured anxiety to a cold, calculating realization. The luxury lifestyle she had felt so deeply entitled to was gone. The bottomless well of stolen family money had run dry, and there was no magical bailout coming to save them. Chelsea stood up from the heavy leather conference chair. She did not look at Jamal with pity or love or even basic human decency. She looked at him with profound, unadulterated disgust. She methodically picked up her designer handbag, the one my father had likely paid for with embezzled logistics funds, and draped it over her shoulder. Jamal reached out a trembling hand toward her, begging her to sit back down and figure this out with him. Chelsea pulled her arm away, stepping smoothly out of his reach. She looked down at the man who had spent his entire life being prioritized above everyone else and delivered her final verdict. "I did not sign up to be poor," Chelsea stated. Her voice was devoid of any emotion, entirely cold and transactional. With that single devastating sentence, she turned her back on her husband and walked out of the settlement conference room, allowing the heavy wooden door to click shut behind her. Jamal buried his face in his hands and began to weep loudly. The golden child, the man who had spent 38 years being shielded from every consequence, was left sitting in a sterile office entirely alone, facing the prospect of federal prison with absolutely nothing to his name. I reached out and closed the video link on my laptop. The silence in my office was deeply satisfying. I had not engaged in a screaming match. I had not lowered myself to their level of toxic emotional warfare. I had simply applied the truth with maximum leverage and allowed their own corruption to destroy them. I stood up and walked over to the expansive windows of my corner office, looking out over the busy city streets. I was a newlywed, a highly successful business owner, and I was finally entirely free from the shadows of my biological family. I took a deep breath, ready to return to my actual work, when my office phone buzzed with an urgent priority tone. I tapped the speaker button, expecting a routine update from my administrative team. It was the head of my building's security detail. His voice was tense, betraying a rare breach in his usual professional calm. He informed me that there was a major disturbance occurring in the main lobby. Vivian had somehow bypassed the outer security perimeter. My mother was currently causing a massive scene surrounded by my staff and building personnel. She had not come to demand an apology or shout threats. According to the security chief, my mother had just dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor of my lobby, completely breaking down and begging to see me. I pressed the button on my desk phone to end the call with my security chief. The plush quiet of my corner office was completely at odds with the chaotic scene he had just described unfolding on the ground floor. My mother, a woman whose entire identity was constructed around strict country club decorum and projecting an image of untouchable wealth, was currently weeping on the imported marble floor of my corporate lobby. I did not rush. I took a moment to smooth the front of my tailored blazer, picked up my leather handbag, and walked toward the private executive elevator. The descent to the ground floor took exactly 45 seconds. During that brief ride, I allowed myself to process the sheer magnitude of Vivian's desperation. For 35 years, she had treated me as a secondary character in Jamal's grand narrative. She had sneered at my career, belittled my relationships, and ultimately abandoned me on the eve of my wedding. Now her golden child was facing federal prison. Her husband was a disgraced, terminated executive, and she was seeking salvation from the very daughter she had relentlessly discarded. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The main lobby of my public relations firm was a sprawling modern space designed to intimidate and impress high-level corporate clients. It featured towering glass walls, minimalist aesthetic furniture, and a massive reception desk carved from dark slate. Right in the center of that immaculate space was Vivian. She was kneeling on the cold floor, her usually flawless hair disheveled and falling around her face. She was wearing a trench coat hastily thrown over a simple blouse, completely lacking the coordinated expensive accessories she usually wore like armor. Several of my junior staff members and 2 uniformed security guards were standing in a wide circle around her, looking deeply uncomfortable. They knew who she was, and they were professionally trained not to engage with hysterical individuals. But watching the mother of their chief executive officer completely break down was an unprecedented situation. I stepped out of the elevator. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble, a sharp, authoritative sound that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the lobby. My staff visibly relaxed the moment they saw me collectively stepping back to let me handle the crisis. Vivian turned her head at the sound of my approach. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. When she saw me, she let out a loud, dramatic wail that echoed off the high ceilings. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling slightly, and threw herself in my direction. My security detail instantly tensed, preparing to intercept her, but I raised a single hand to wave them off. I stood my ground, allowing my mother to close the distance until she was standing just a few feet away. "Zora, you have to help us." Vivian sobbed, her hands grasping frantically at the air between us, as if she wanted to grab my blazer, but was too terrified of my boundaries to actually make contact. "You have to stop this. Everything is gone. Calvin's accounts are frozen. Jamal's accounts are frozen. The accounts tied to the investigation are frozen. We barely have access to anything liquid anymore." I looked at her, my expression completely neutral. I did not offer a comforting hug. I did not usher her into a private room to hide her shame from my employees. She had chosen a public stage for her performance, and I was going to let her play her part right here under the bright lobby lights. "You are listing the natural legal consequences of massive corporate embezzlement, Mom," I stated calmly. My voice was steady and professional, devoid of any daughterly sympathy. "Calvin stole millions of dollars from the Sterling conglomerate to fund Jamal's lifestyle. The federal authorities are simply recovering the stolen assets. That is how the justice system operates. I cannot issue a public relations spin to make federal fraud charges disappear." Vivian shook her head violently, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You do not understand the full scope of what Calvin did," she cried out, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "He did not just use the corporate accounts. When the federal investigators locked down Jamal's offshore holding companies yesterday, Calvin panicked. He confessed everything to me last night. Zora, to hide the stolen money from the initial corporate auditors, Calvin took out massive, highly leveraged loans. He used our family estate as the primary collateral to secure the cash. He thought he could move the money around and pay it back before anyone noticed the deficit. I felt a brief flicker of genuine shock, though I kept it entirely masked behind my calm exterior. Calvin had actually bet the family mansion on Jamal's non-existent tech ventures. The sheer arrogance required to leverage a multi-million-dollar property to cover up corporate theft was staggering. The bank accelerated the loans after Calvin's financial collapse. Vivian continued, her voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper. The foreclosure process has been moving for weeks. We exhausted every extension and every attempt to refinance. The foreclosure process has been moving for weeks. Once Calvin's financial collapse became public, the bank refused any further extension, and the sale moved forward under the existing default proceedings. The final sale closed this morning, Zora. The house is gone. We no longer own it. They are taking everything. We are going to be completely homeless by the end of the week. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying, toxic expectation. The initial panic was beginning to recede, replaced by the deep, ingrained entitlement she had wielded my entire life. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, straightening her posture slightly. "I am still your mother," Zora Vivian said. Her tone shifted, attempting to invoke the sacred, unbreakable bond of family loyalty that she herself had severed weeks ago. "You cannot sit there and let your own parents be thrown out onto the street. You cannot let the bank take the home you grew up in. I know you are angry about the wedding, but family is family. We are in a desperate crisis, and you have the power to fix this instantly." I stared at her, marveling at the absolute delusion required to deliver that speech. She was demanding loyalty after providing none. "You married into the Sterling family." Vivian pushed forward, her eyes darting to my large diamond engagement ring. "Xavier is a billionaire. His family owns commercial real estate across the entire globe. Paying off a single bank loan on a residential estate is absolute pocket change to him. You need to talk to your husband. You need to tell him to wire the funds to the bank right now and clear Calvin's debt. Just write us a check and fix this. You owe us that much for exposing your father to the board." The audacity was breathtaking. She was not just asking for a bailout. She was demanding that my husband, the nephew of the man her husband had stolen from, use his personal wealth to save her social status. She truly believed that because she carried the title of mother, she was entitled to unlimited forgiveness and endless financial rescue. I did not laugh. I did not yell. I simply looked at the woman who had handed me a plastic $50 gift card in a botanical conservatory and told me my wedding was a cheap mistake. "Stand up, Vivian," I said smoothly. My voice carried an absolute freezing authority. "Wipe your face. We are leaving." Vivian let out a shaky breath, a sudden bright spark of hope illuminating her tear-stained face. She genuinely believed her manipulation had worked. She thought the mention of family loyalty had cracked my professional armor. She thought she had successfully tapped into the obedient, compliant daughter she had controlled for 3 decades. She quickly wiped her eyes, nodding eagerly, and followed me as I turned and walked out through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. My personal security driver was waiting at the curb in a sleek black SUV. He opened the rear door and I gestured for Vivian to get inside. I slid into the leather seat beside her, completely ignoring her attempts to make relieved, grateful small talk. I instructed my driver to head directly to the family estate. The drive took 30 minutes. We navigated through the busy downtown traffic and merged onto the highway that led to the affluent gated suburbs where I had spent my childhood. Vivian spent the entire ride staring out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, occasionally shooting me appreciative glances that I refused to acknowledge. She was constructing a new narrative in her head. A narrative where I was the dutiful daughter rushing to save her majestic home, proving my ultimate devotion to the family hierarchy. When our black SUV finally turned onto the familiar tree-lined street of my childhood neighborhood, the massive wrought iron gates of the family estate came into view. The sprawling, beautifully landscaped property sat perfectly manicured under the afternoon sun. But as we pulled through the open gates and navigated up the long, circular cobblestone driveway, Vivian gasped. Parked directly in front of the grand pillared entrance of the house were 3 massive industrial moving trucks. A team of professional movers in matching uniforms was actively carrying heavy, expensive furniture out the front doors and loading it into the cavernous backs of the vehicles. Vivian's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic, but then she looked over at me and let out a breathless, relieved laugh. Oh, thank goodness, Vivian breathed, clutching her chest. You bought it, didn't you, Zora? That is why you brought me here. You bought the house before some stranger could take it from us. Tell these movers to stop and put everything back inside. We can work out whatever arrangement you want afterward. I waited until the SUV came to a complete stop behind the moving trucks. The driver shifted the vehicle into park. I did not look at the house. I looked directly at my mother. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, heavy manila folder. It was not sealed with wax. It was a standard, highly official legal envelope used for transferring significant real estate holdings. I untied the string closure and slid out a thick stack of watermarked documents. The top page featured the bold, unmistakable seal of the State Property Registry. I held the document up so the afternoon sunlight caught the legal signatures at the bottom of the page. Vivian stared at the paperwork, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she tried to read the dense legal text. My holding company purchased the property through the foreclosure sale. I explained smoothly, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. My financial team had been monitoring the proceedings for weeks, and when the property became legally available for sale, we submitted the winning bid. The transaction closed this morning, and the title has now transferred to my company. Vivian let out a loud, joyous sob. She reached out, trying to grab my hand in absolute gratitude. Oh, Zora, I knew you would not let us down. I knew you loved this family too much to let us lose our home. You saved us. I pulled my hand back smoothly, shifting the property deed out of her reach. I looked her dead in the eye, watching the joyous, relieved smile freeze completely on her face. I bought the property, Mom, I stated, my tone dropping to a cold, devastating whisper. But I am not giving it to you. The words hung in the warm afternoon air, carrying the absolute finality of a gavel striking a judge's block. I watched the profound devastation wash over Vivian's face. The horrific realization that I legally owned the ground she was standing on, and that I was actively evicting her, finally broke through her decades of deeply ingrained entitlement. She reached out, her hands shaking violently, but my security driver stepped forward immediately. He positioned his broad shoulders smoothly between us, creating a physical barrier that she did not dare cross. Vivian let out a raw, agonizing wail and crumpled onto the hard cobblestone of the circular driveway. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly as the professional moving team completely ignored her, continuing to carry her expensive antique furniture out the front doors of the estate. I stood perfectly still, watching the movers load a massive, ornate gilded mirror into the back of their cavernous truck. That mirror had hung in the grand foyer for 20 years. It was the exact spot where Vivian used to check her flawless reflection before leaving for her elite country club luncheons. Now it was just another seized asset being hauled away to satisfy a massive defaulted bank loan. The sheer scale of their financial ruin was playing out right in front of me, and I did not feel a single drop of pity. I felt the cool, clean satisfaction of a meticulously executed crisis management strategy reaching its logical conclusion. The heavy mahogany front doors of the estate swung open again. Two movers stepped out carrying a heavy leather sofa. Following closely behind them, trailing like broken shadows, were my father Calvin and my older brother Jamal. The visual contrast between the men who had threatened me at the private airport terminal and the men walking down the driveway now was staggering. Calvin was completely unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant senior vice president was gone. He wore a wrinkled, unbuttoned dress shirt and slacks that looked entirely too large for his deflated frame. His shoulders were slumped heavily under the weight of his impending federal fraud charges. I was carrying a small taped cardboard box filled with his personal office files. Right beside him, Jamal looked even worse. The golden child was dragging a single dark duffel bag across the cobblestone, his expensive designer sneakers scuffing against the pavement. His eyes were red, swollen, and deeply bloodshot. Chelsea was nowhere to be seen. She had made good on her cold promise and walked straight out of the legal mediation office, leaving him to face his absolute poverty entirely alone. Jamal had spent his entire 38 years believing he was a brilliant visionary entrepreneur. Now he was just a disgraced broke man facing federal indictment with no wife, no corporate credit cards, and nowhere to sleep. Calvin spotted my black SUV idling in the driveway. He saw Vivian weeping on the curb, and his eyes darted to the legal document resting in my hands. He dropped his cardboard box onto the driveway and rushed forward, his face twisting into a desperate mask of paternal authority that no longer held any power. "Zora, what are you doing here?" Calvin demanded, his voice cracking as he tried to summon his old domineering volume. "Tell these movers to stop right now. This is a massive misunderstanding with the bank. I just need a few days to liquidate some offshore assets, and I can clear the default. You have to call Richard Sterling and tell him to call off the financial regulators. You have to fix this." I did not back away. I held up the watermarked property deed, letting the afternoon sunlight catch the official state registry seal at the bottom of the page. "There are no offshore assets left, Dad," I stated, my voice carrying a smooth, lethal calm. "The federal investigators froze every single account attached to Jamal's fraudulent companies yesterday afternoon. The bank accelerated your highly leveraged loans weeks ago, after the financial investigation exposed the risk. You failed to cure the default, and the foreclosure process ran its course. My holding company purchased the property through the sale, and the transaction officially closed this morning. I hold the absolute clear title to this estate. I am not here to fix your narrative. I am here because the possession deadline in the foreclosure process has expired. You received the required notices weeks ago. Today is the scheduled move-out date, and I am here to oversee the transition of my new real estate acquisition." Calvin stared at the property deed, his mouth falling open in silent horror. The last remaining pillar of his false empire crumbled directly at his feet. He looked around the sprawling manicured lawns, the towering oak trees, and the grand brick facade of the home he had used to project his illusion of immense wealth. It all belonged to the daughter he had relentlessly discarded. Jamal dropped his duffel bag and stumbled forward, his face crumpled in misery. "Zora, please," Jamal begged, his voice whining and pathetic. "Chelsea left me. She took her jewelry and walked out. I have absolutely zero money. My accounts are frozen. The lawyers will not even return my phone calls unless I pay a retainer up front. I have nowhere to go. You cannot kick us out onto the street. We are your family. You have a billionaire husband. You have endless resources. Just let us stay in the guest house. We will stay out of your way. Please, Zora, you have to help me." I looked at the golden boy, the brother who had gleefully stolen a vintage bottle of champagne from my rehearsal dinner, the brother who had used my college tuition money to fund his delusions. He was begging for a handout from the very sister he had mocked just weeks ago. I turned my gaze away from his weeping face and looked down the long, sweeping driveway. I looked across the pristine, sprawling grounds where I had spent most of my childhood, feeling like an unwanted guest in my own family. Every corner of the estate carried a memory of being overlooked while Jamal was celebrated. Now the entire property belonged to me. I took a slow, deliberate breath, channeling every ounce of my professional and personal triumph into my voice. "You said Jamal's trip mattered more than my little party," I said, looking directly into Calvin's defeated eyes. "You looked me in the face and told me that my rushed, cheap wedding was an embarrassment to your corporate legacy. You told me that I was just a crisis manager who cleaned up messes, and that I should be grateful for the scraps you threw my way." I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, forcing Calvin to look up at me. "Well, my little party just bought your house," I stated, the words landing like heavy, deliberate strikes. "My little party just acquired the very ground you are standing on. I am not letting you stay in the guest house. I am not writing you a check. I have already instructed my architects to begin redevelopment plans for this property. Once the necessary approvals are in place, the parts of this estate that represented your old family hierarchy will be completely transformed, subject to zoning approval and redevelopment permits. I intend to transform this property into the new global headquarters for my public relations firm. Every time you drive past these gates, you will see my name on the building. You will see the empire I built without a single ounce of your support." Vivian let out a loud, wretched gasp, covering her face with her hands. Calvin simply stared at me, his spirit entirely broken, the realization of his total subjugation washing over him. Jamal sank down onto the curb next to Vivian, burying his head in his knees. They were a shattered, ruined portrait of toxic entitlement facing the absolute harsh reality of accountability. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against two small, sharp pieces of plastic. I pulled my hand out and held my fist suspended in the air right above them. I opened my fingers. The two snapped halves of the $50 fast casual restaurant gift card fluttered down through the warm air. The plastic pieces hit the cobblestone driveway with a quiet, distinct clatter, landing directly at Vivian and Calvin's feet. "Buy yourselves lunch," I said, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any mercy. I turned my back on them and walked toward the waiting black SUV. My security driver immediately opened the heavy armored door. I stepped up into the cool, quiet sanctuary of the vehicle. Xavier was waiting for me in the plush leather back seat. He looked incredibly handsome, his dark eyes shining with profound pride and quiet amusement. He did not ask how the eviction went. He already knew I had handled it flawlessly. Xavier reached out and took my hand, his long, strong fingers intertwining perfectly with mine. He raised my hand to his lips, pressing a warm, solid kiss against the back of my knuckles. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, his deep voice wrapping around me like a protective shield. I looked out the tinted window one last time. I saw Vivian, Calvin, and Jamal sitting on the curb of their former estate, surrounded by moving boxes and snapped plastic holding absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own consequences. They looked incredibly small, shrinking rapidly in the rearview mirror as my driver shifted the SUV into gear and pulled smoothly down the cobblestone driveway. "I am more than ready," I replied, resting my head against Xavier's shoulder. We drove through the heavy wrought iron gates and turned onto the open highway, leaving the toxic shadows of my past behind us forever. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady rhythmic hum of the vehicle carrying us forward. I had stripped away the corruption, dismantled the lies, and reclaimed my absolute power. I was looking forward to a brilliant, untouchable future, a thriving global empire, and the true, fiercely loyal family I had finally built for myself. I smiled a deep, radiant smile, knowing with absolute certainty that I would never have to fix their disasters ever again. The most powerful lesson from Zora's story is that your worth should never depend on how useful, obedient, wealthy, or socially valuable you appear to other people, even when those people are your own family. For most of her life, Zora lived inside a family system that measured love through status, money, and convenience. Her parents did not openly say that Jamal mattered more because he was their favorite son, but their actions communicated it repeatedly. They drained resources meant for Zora to support Jamal's failed ambitions, minimized her professional success, threatened her inheritance whenever she resisted them, and finally chose a luxury trip to Milan over attending her wedding. The tragedy was not simply that Zora's family treated her badly. The deeper problem was that they expected her to continue accepting it because they believed she would always need something from them. Calvin used money as leverage. Vivian used guilt and the idea of family loyalty. Jamal relied on entitlement. Chelsea used emotional manipulation and public sympathy. Each person believed that Zora could ultimately be controlled because she would be afraid of losing financial support, family approval, professional connections, or social belonging. But Zora's transformation begins when she stops negotiating for a place in a family that has already shown her how little they value her. At the rehearsal dinner, she does not beg her parents to reconsider. She does not try to convince Vivian that the wedding matters. She does not plead with Jamal to return the champagne. When the $50 gift card becomes the final symbol of 35 years of disrespect, she breaks it and tells them to leave. That moment is important because Zora finally understands that boundaries are not arguments. A boundary does not require the other person to agree with you. It only requires you to decide what behavior you will no longer accept. Her story also teaches the importance of building a life that cannot easily be held hostage by someone else. Calvin believed that withdrawing his share of the wedding expenses would force Zora into submission. Instead, she paid the remaining catering bill herself. He threatened to remove her from the family trust, but Zora had already built a successful crisis management business. Later, when he threatened to blacklist her company, she no longer reacted like the frightened daughter he remembered. She understood that the professional identity she had created through years of work was stronger than the artificial leverage her father had used against her. Financial independence matters in this story, But the lesson goes beyond money. Emotional independence matters just as much. Zora learns that she does not need her parents to approve of Xavier for her marriage to be meaningful. She does not need Calvin to walk her down the aisle for the ceremony to be complete. She does not need Vivian to publicly celebrate her in order to know that she is successful. Once she stops asking toxic people to validate her life, their ability to control her begins to disappear. Another lesson is that truth does not need to scream when it has evidence behind it. Zora is a crisis public relations strategist, so she understands that emotional chaos can easily become a distraction. Her family constantly attempts to rewrite reality. Vivian claims abandoning the wedding was tough love. Calvin tries to portray himself as a victim of Zora's vindictiveness. Chelsea goes online and paints herself as the innocent woman being attacked by a jealous sister-in-law. Zora does not defeat those narratives by becoming louder. She defeats them by refusing to lie. When Calvin demands that she invent a fake medical emergency to save his career, she refuses. When the financial misconduct is exposed, she works from independently verified findings rather than manufacturing revenge. When Chelsea launches a public attack, Zora does not descend into an emotional social media war. The truth eventually becomes more powerful than every story her family tries to manufacture. That lesson applies far beyond corporate scandals. When people are committed to misunderstanding you endlessly, explaining yourself may not change them. Sometimes the strongest response is to remain consistent. Keep your records, protect your reputation, and allow their own behavior to reveal who they are. Zora's relationship with Xavier also offers another important lesson. Healthy love does not require you to become smaller. Her biological family constantly diminishes her. Xavier does the opposite. He respects her intelligence, protects her boundaries, and allows her to make her own decisions. Even when he has enormous wealth and influence, he does not treat Zora as someone who needs to be rescued from every problem. He stands beside her while she handles the battles that belong to her. That distinction matters. Support is not the same thing as control. Someone who genuinely loves you should not need your weakness in order to feel powerful. Perhaps the strongest message comes at the very end of the story. The same family that once handed Zora a $50 gift card and dismissed her wedding as a meaningless little party eventually loses the estate that represented their status. Zora becomes the owner. Yet the real victory is not the property itself. The house is only a symbol. Her true victory is that she no longer wants their approval. The people who spent decades convincing Zora that she needed them eventually discover that she had been the strongest person in the family all along. So the lesson is simple. Do not spend your life proving your value to people who benefit from pretending you have none. Build your skills, protect your independence, set boundaries, stay grounded in truth, and surround yourself with people who respect who you are, without demanding that you shrink first. Sometimes walking away from the people who refuse to value you is not losing your family, it is finally making room to build a healthier one. If Zora's journey reminded you that real power begins when you stop begging for approval and start protecting your own worth. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, what boundary would you never allow anyone to cross again?